Good afternoon, everybody. Eddie Webb. We are here in the New Media Lab at Mesa Community College in Mesa, Arizona, and we have really a great show today. We have Professor Jaime Herrera from the English department at Mesa Community College. He's been here, I think, 30 years, right?
A long time, yeah. About 30 years, Eddie.
About 30 years.
Thank you.
Jaime, born in Juarez, Mexico.
I was actually born in El Paso, but raised in Juarez. Yeah, I'm one of those anchor babies, as they call them.
All right. Born in El Paso, raised in Juarez. I had the pleasure of traveling with Jaime a few years ago. We took a film crew down, and we were talking about the project I was working on was indigenous identity in border towns. And we went down there and just kind of saw what happened. And Jaime was working on a piece on an artist, a muralist in Juarez, right?
Right, yeah.
And we were able to interview him and spend the day with him, or a couple days, I guess.
It was a couple of days. It was a good trip.
It was a good trip, man. I really loved the whole experience. Jaime teaches Chicano literature here at Mesa Community College. It's a real popular class. Over the years, I've been to it. We'll probably spin some of that. We did a profile on Jaime as we're talking through this podcast today. But we're going to start out with The House on Mango Street, written by Sandra Cisneros, who was one of the first cultural writers that when I came back to college as a reentry student that I really connected to. I had read Elena Deloria's book, a lot of her work, and I think it was called Bluebird. Water Lily, that was the name of it.
Water Lily.
Wow, I can't believe my memory snapped into line.
That's good.
And then the next book I read was The House on Mango. No, it wasn't. It was Woman Hollering Creek.
That's a good book, too.
And then the next book was The House on Mango Street. This is back when you were in college. Your teachers actually had you read books. We don't do that nowadays. We're too busy to read books. Tell me about The House on Mango Street, Jaime.
So, I mean, I've had a long relationship with this book. And over the years, I've met Sandra Cisneros a few times. Actually, I have a book here that she dedicated to my wife because I had Sandra Cisneros out to MTC to do a reading, and my wife was very pregnant at the time with our second daughter. So I was running between airport, hotel, hospital, trying to keep a hold of everything. And April 4th, my daughter was born, and it was the same day that Sandra was going to do a reading. So it was a crazy day, and she dedicated the book to my wife, on that very blessed day. And I first started using this book when I was teaching for Upward Bound in El Paso, at UT El Paso. And at the time, I don't know if I really understood the depth of the book and the importance of the book. But later I realized that there's been a long history of Chicanos writing. I mean, newspapers, articles, books, novels, poetry, short stories, and as a matter of fact, a lot of that was happening in Spanish. But in the U.S., sometimes we couldn't process that as well because there were people who didn't speak the language or didn't read in Spanish. But there was an abundance of literature. But Sandra Cisneros, when she published the book in '84, she was sort of the bellwether of some changes in Chicano literature, from a very sort of patriarchal approach to writing and to culture to a more feminist sort of centered approach. And she talked, and there was less about the immigrant experience, which was, and still is, and a very important part of that Chicano experience. But she talked more about the urban experience and sort of the urban Chicano. Her character in this book is growing up in Chicago, in sort of an impoverished part of Chicago, where there are a lot of people like her. The main character, Esperanza, at one point says, all brown, all around, we are safe. And it's a Bildungsroman. It's Esperanza trying to figure out who she is. She's she's going through puberty. We never get an exact age, but she's probably about 12, 13, maybe 14. And she's trying to figure out who she is culturally. And there are parts of the culture that she doesn't accept. But at the end of the novel, she comes to accept sort of who she is and where she's going and what she's going to do. Anyway, so I've used the book for a long, long time. I joke with some of my colleagues that I should be getting a commission from Sandra Cisneros. I've probably sold thousands of her books. And every once in a while, I do run into her. I actually ran into her in Mexico this year in San Miguel. I didn't have the opportunity to talk to her, but she lives there now, which is interesting because she's grown up in Chicago, and then she moved to San Antonio. And then I think she did a stint in New York City. But she's always lived in the U.S. I mean, she was born in the U.S. Her dad is from Mexico City. And now she's living in Mexico, and I kind of want to ask her about what that experience is like for her as an older, grown adult woman to come back to the country, which is, where her roots are, but not ever having lived in that country. So it must be a kind of interesting experience for her. As far as I know, she speaks English. She speaks Spanish. I don't know how fluently she does, but I think she really enjoys living where she does. San Miguel Allende is near Guanajuato. It's in the same state of Guanajuato. Sort of artsy community with a lot of expats, a lot of Americans, a lot of Canadians.
Yeah, it's a pretty well-known place for artists. Yeah.
It's a beautiful, beautiful city. I sometimes have some reservations about it because there's so many Americans there that they've really changed the culture of the town. They've sort of
anglicized it.
They've anglicized it, and what's that term when you move into a neighborhood and you change it?
Gentrification.
They've gentrified the whole city, and some of the original inhabitants of the city, Mexicans and some indigenous people, now they have a hard time being able to afford to live in the city. Nevertheless, it's a beautiful, beautiful city, colonial, old, established like in the late 1500s.
Well, I think there was in the 70s, 80s, there was this emergence of Chicano writers and American Indian writers who they themselves were coming into their own identity. I know people hate admitting that kind of thing. Some people do, some people don't. But there was a whole bunch of those folks even coming out of ASU, who kind of showed up just sort of whatever, and then sort of became the voice of cultures. And a lot of the literature is around going home and reclaiming their identity. Yeah. So it's nice to hear she is where she is and doing what she's doing. And I guess always we talk about the credentials of a person, and I'm very, very interested in the duality of identity.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about it in our last show about that sort of, you brought that up about how we, move in and out of these two cultures and how people learn how to do that. And with yourself being so strongly bilingual, it must make a huge impression on your students, especially when you're doing critical analysis of literature. Outside of her own personal journey, what's the strongest? Do you ever teach the transformational arc in story, like Act 1, Act 2?
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's Esperanza who's the narrator, and it's a series of. I mean, they're even shorter than short stories. I think the term is vignettes.
Vignettes, yeah.
And Sandra Cisneros, in the preface to like the 25th anniversary, says that the book came out of her graduate school experience. She was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, a very prestigious MA program in writing. And one of the assignments in class was write about your house. And as she looked at other people's writing, she's like, well, my house looks nothing like their house. It's not a two-story. It's not a white picket fence. There's not a dog in the yard. Yeah. And she felt a little bit of shame until she decided, well, I'm going to write about my house. And that's how this book came about. Uh-huh. And it's fiction, but there's some autobiographical aspects. Esperanza, the main character, to get back to your question, she feels a lot of shame in the beginning of the novel. And there are vignettes that talk about that. She's ashamed of her name, for example, Esperanza, because people have a hard time pronouncing it. She also does not like her name because it harkens back to her great-grandmother, who was also Esperanza. And her great-grandmother apparently led a very frustrated life. She sat in her house all her life, sort of looking out the window with her sadness sitting on her elbow, as she describes it. And she didn't want to be like that. She didn't want to be a traditional Mexican woman who was inside the house all the time. She wanted to have her own house. She wanted to be inside and outside the house. She wanted to do whatever she wanted to do inside and outside the house. And the house is a great metaphor in the novel, too, for, even the American dream of having a house. But as she's ashamed of her neighborhood because she says people are scared to drive into our neighborhood. She's ashamed of her house because they only have one bathroom that the 6 family members have to share. She's ashamed of her friends. She's ashamed of a lot of things. So shame is one of the themes in the novel. But as the novel progresses, Esperanza learns to work through that shame and come to a place of empowerment. And by the end of the novel, she embraces her name. She embraces her house, her family, her friends, her culture. And this theme that you talked about, Eddie, earlier, by the end of the novel, even though she's still like a kid, like 12 or 13, she knows she's going to get out of Mango Street. She knows she's going to break free. As a matter of fact, she says that something about the arms of Mango Street are not strong enough to hold me. But she will return. And that's sort of that coming back home that you talked about early in a lot of these novels. I tell my students that that's a strong theme in Chicano literature. And I tell them that part of that is the fact that Chicanos, before that Mexicans, before that indigenous people, and they're all related, they've never left home. This continent has always been home, or at least for the last 20, 25,000 years since they first came here, perhaps from Asia. And that the larger American experience of immigration from Europe, for example, this continent is not home. And for those people to go back home, it means going back to France or Britain or Poland or Russia or wherever they may be from. But for Chicanos, the concept of home is still very, very strong because this continent is home. So there's that sense of going back home. And there's that irony in that phrase that sometimes people use very, in a very racist way, to go back to where you came from, But Sandra Cisneros, we talked about this earlier, she's going back to where she came from. She's going back to Mexico. She's living in Mexico. And, eventually, I don't know, I think that's the goal of many Chicanos who are here, not all of them. But for me personally, too, I think that's what I want to do. I want to go back to where I came from when I retire.
How do your students respond to the house on Mango Street?
A lot of my students, they like it in part because it's very easy to read. It's like 110 pages with lots of white space. I mean, they can knock it out 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Some of them struggle, especially those who don't identify as Chicano, because they say, well, that's not my experience.
Right.
I wasn't a girl growing up in a poor household, in a poor neighborhood in the city. And I tell them, listen, there are universal themes in this novel. We all struggle with identity, whether you're black or whether you're Native American or whether you're white or Chicano. We all struggle with identity issues. How do we fit into this larger society? And some of us struggle with that perhaps throughout our lifetime. But they tend to like it. And once we start talking about some of the issues in the book, there's some beautiful vignettes. One of my favorite vignettes is 5 paragraphs long. It's just a beautiful little vignette that I don't know how she did it, but it starts with Esperanza in her bedroom, and her father walks in and sits on the bed next to her and tells her that her grandfather has died. This is his own father. And he starts crying. And Esperanza is freaking out because she says, I don't know what to do, because she's a kid, and her father, who's a strong man, is crying. And she's like, what do I do?
Yeah.
And as the paragraphs develop, you can see her mature. And by the end of the vignette, like the 5th paragraph, literally, she says, I hold and hold and hold him. And she's figured out what to do. You know, she's mature. She's an adult. She's comforted her own father. And in those 5 paragraphs, you can see her growing, you know, from a child to an adult. So once we start talking about the depth and the richness of individual vignettes, I think the students get a little bit more enthused because they see what's happening and they see that there are a lot of universal themes in the novel, but there are also some very specific, you know, Chicano-related themes. You know, growing up as a member of a Hispanic household and some of the discrimination that Esperanza faces, not just based on her race, but also based on her gender. You know, there's that sort of patriarchal system that's around her as part of a traditional, you know, sort of Mexican household. But the students, I think, eventually, I think they end up liking it. I think their approach initially is it's a very simple book, but by the end of our discussions and by when they write a paper, I think they appreciate a little bit more of the complexity of the book.
And I think that's what the college experience is all about, right?
Absolutely,
it's, an awakening, right, to who you are and where you are in history. And I think that's what that Renaissance in the 70s and 80s was about, this idea that people, it's in there, and when given an environment and an opportunity to explore their own identity, I mean, it's a beautiful thing to watch people, you know, really, they one thing I've learned is they do, students that come from these communities do have a deeper sense of identity. But it's not given in the right places it can be a very oppressive identity. And so when you have an environment where you can explore that to your fullest, it's an amazing experience to go through with your students. And that makes apparently some people very, very nervous in our, you know, these days. But you see these books, Scott Momaday, Leslie
Right.
Silko, Joy Harjo, who's won this big national award a couple years in a row. All of that is about this sense of finding oneself, you know? And in American Indian cultures, there's always been this struggle between Pan-American Indianism, you know, or tribal sovereignty, tribal identity. There's no such thing as like Indian, you know? I mean, there's 500 different tribes, you know, different languages and cultures. People were as diverse, people living in what's now called South Dakota as opposed to people who are living in, you know,
LA,
North
Phoenix,
Carolina, or what California was pre-Spanish conquest, right? So people are turning over even the next layer of identity, not just, you know, Indian, you know, or American Indian or Native American, but who are they specific to their language and tribe? And it's becoming, you know, it's scary because the languages are going away so fast. But I was wondering, like, with your students, do you walk people through, because you and I have had this discussion before, like, well, what is a Chicano? What is a Mexican? What is a Latino, Latina? What is a, you know, like you have this word and it's supposed to encompass all of this diversity. And do you have Mexican-American students who are resistant to the, like, hey, no, because Chicano was a movement, right? It's not a people.
Yeah.
And so is there that same kind of journey of identity?
There is, and there's still, even now, you know, that discussion about the term that is used, and now it's Latinx or Chicanx that's being used. And we have that discussion in class, and actually one of my students, who's actually a colleague of ours here at MCC, Cesar Becerra, he just earned his PhD, and it's really, really...
Cesar,
Cesar, really bright guy, very accomplished. I mean, my hat's off to him. And he and I have talked about it because he grew up in California.
Yeah.
And his mom worked, I think, in a cannery, and they also worked the field. And he identifies with the term Chicano, and he tells me why. You know, even though he didn't grow up in the 60s.
Right.
But he identifies with that term. And when I told him I identify with Mexican American, we had a discussion about that. And I told him, Cesar, I don't consider myself Chicano because of people like you, because I have so much respect for you and what you've done. When the 60s Chicano movement was going on, I was a snotty kid in Juarez growing up on the street. I was like 7,
Right.
I had no idea. I didn't learn about the Chicano movement till graduate school, in my 20s.
Right.
I've never worked the fields. I didn't grow up in the U.S. I never faced that kind of racism and discrimination of oppression, at least that I was aware of in Juarez or El Paso. So in deference to that, I don't use the term, but I respect people like you who use that term. I use the term Mexican American in part out of respect for my parents, because they're Mexican.
Right.
I mean, they were born and grew up in Mexico. I grew up in Mexico too. And even though some people think that hyphenation makes you not one and not the other, I just want to keep that connection to Mexico because that's a great part of who I am. But also, I'm also American. American is a problematic term too, because the whole continent is American. So we have that discussion in class, and ultimately I tell students, whatever term you use, understand what it means and be comfortable with that term, and sort of wear it proudly. And some of my students choose Mexican American. As a matter of fact, the anthology we're using for class, it was published just recently, like 5 years ago, by a very well-known Chicano writer. And the anthology is called Mexican American Literature. It's not called Chicano literature. It's not called Latinx literature. So that term is still used. ASU's Chicano Studies program in the last few years changed its name to Transborder program to talk about, to emphasize the fact that the Chicano experience isn't necessarily just in the U.S. It's also in Mexico, in northern Mexico, and it extends far into the U.S., far north, and it even extends far south into Mexico. So we have that discussion about what terms to use. Some of my students opt for Latinx, some for Hispanic, some for Chicano, some for Mexican American, but I tell them there's a spectrum. On one extreme you might have Mexican. On the other extreme you might have American. Somewhere in there you choose where you are based on your own identity, your language, your culture, upbringing, your family, and you choose the term. And whatever term you choose, that's the good term.
There's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum.
Because I'm young, but having grown up in California, the Chicano, that was just a very common term, right? But there was also, I remember getting lessons about zoot suit, right? And this was about the farm labor workers, pre-Cesar Chavez, who were wanting to break out, right, of being just a labor in the field, wanted to dress well and drive nice cars, and be a part of American culture on their terms. And, that was a big movement at one time, and I'm old enough to just barely remember that before it really transitioned into Chicano. And now in California, what I really, really love is a lot of my brothers over there, Watsonville and places like that have really embraced American Indian churches, really getting into Aztec and Mayan dancing and ceremonies, and you see wherever they plug in, anybody plugs into the spectrum of these words, they kind of can all lead, back home.
Yeah.
And back home is ceremony. Back home is prayer. Back home is spirituality. And I think I've met so many people in the 70s and 80s, they call it the Red Road, people on the Red Road. And that's what was happening. People finding their way back to their identity, because this American identity rejects anybody else's identity other than this melting pot identity, right? And we see this as of September 28th, 2020, a memorandum for the heads of executive departments and agencies coming out of the White House, out of the president's office, in recent days has written an executive order to review and determine if teaching, advocating, or promoting anything that he talks about combating race and sex stereotyping, racist or sexist teachings, and they want to review things like critical race theory, white privilege, intersectionality, systemic racism, positionality, racial humiliation, unconscious bias. And they're really going after this idea of diversity training. In the college, in the university, as scholars, especially as writers of literature, our job is to explore the mind, explore history, explore culture, explore language, right? And to teach students to have critical thinking around these issues. And Cisneros is probably a part of that group that out came critical race theory.
Right.
Yeah. To examine what this means. When you read this memorandum coming out of the White House that wants to make critical race theory a suspicious and conspiracy against the state, what were your thoughts when you sent this to me? And I was like, wow, I didn't even know this happened.
Well, actually, one of my first thoughts as I read it was the rhetoric in here is very similar to the rhetoric that Horn, our AG at one time, and Huppenthal, who was the state superintendent of schools, used at one time to ban ethnic studies. It's the same kind of rhetoric, that any class that talks about the collective experience of a people is wrong, that those values are un-American, that you have to focus on the individual, which is what, the American ideology is the individual is the most important, right?
Right.
And it denies that we live a collective experience, right? I mean, we don't live in a vacuum as individuals. We interact with other people all the time, family, colleagues at work, friends, etc. So that's one of the first things that struck me. The second thing, and I was very, very disappointed, one of our programs here, the TRIO program, they had arranged for a series of 3 presentations. I think they were scheduled to be next week by a very well-known sort of race critic, and they had to cancel them. I mean, this had been going on for months, this setting up for this. And TRIO is a grant program. It's funded through a grant, and they had to cancel that because of this legislation, because of this law. And it is a law. I read about it, and it doesn't go through Congress. There's no vote. The president can just make this a law. So I'm already seeing the effect of this. And Eddie, I'm wondering, eventually what is the effect on what we teach students? So, for example, in the house on Mango Street, the theme of house is very strong. So we talk about the American dream, and we talk about the role that the house has in the American dream. But we also talk about the fact that that dream of a house is not equitable across everybody in this country. That Mexicans, for example, historically, they've been denied that house, or they've done the yard work for a house that's not their own, or they've been allowed in the house, but to clean the house. And maybe they go in through the back door, right? Or they rent a house, as my parents did, in poorer neighborhoods, as Esperanza does with her family. But very few of them have had the opportunity that is the same as a majority of owning, this house. So when we talk about it in my class, I wonder, am I teaching something that, according to this proclamation, is technically against the law? It gets a little bit crazy, Eddie.
It is crazy because to mandate other people use a mandate to prevent other people to explore their own story,
Yeah.
right? Truth, their own cultural identity is crazy. It's beyond. It's actually takes crazy to being violent.
Yeah.
It's a violent act. It's a silent, violent act of telling people, you know, you can't talk about America. You can't talk about, and it's the only way. The only way you heal from something is to take an honest inventory, right? But no one person has the power to take away story. Leslie Silko, in her book Ceremony, and was another book that really, really opened me up. And it's a book about going home.
Yeah.
Right, about a young Laguna man who went off to World War II. In American Indian, in the Indian cultures, being in the military it's all about serving the country.
Right.
And he comes home, because he's having these nightmares that he's gone off to war in World War II and he's fighting Japanese, he's killing Japanese, and he's looking at the Marines that he's with, and they don't look like him, but all the Japanese people that he's killing look like him and his uncles, and he goes mad.
Yeah.
And a part of his healing when he comes home is this piece. She said he's speaking to this traditional man, and he says, "I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see, all we have to fight off illness and death. There is evil and mighty, but it can't stand up to our stories. So they try to destroy the stories. Let the stories be confused or forgotten. They would like that. They would be happy, because then we would be defenseless."
That's really cool, Eddie. Yeah.
Right. And when I read that as a young guy, I was like, whoa, because much like Cisneros, I didn't really know my own story other than just being very, very proud of being a working poor. My family came from the fields, and that identity of, everybody coming to my grandmother's house like at 4 a.m. I think my grandfather invented mocha coffee or whatever it was, because he would like this black coffee and cream and just like a half a pound of sugar and stir it all up.
That was my grandmother, yeah.
Right, and drink that, and then all those guys in the summer, they'd head off either to the fields or the cannery. Now I'm young, right? So I worked in the peach fields, but my family all had worked in the cotton fields, and they're poor Indians and poor white people that intermarried, and but that was part of my identity. I was proud of that. I was so proud. Little towns like Firebaugh and up and down the Central Valley in California, because they had left Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl and the Depression and all that sort of stuff. Grapes of Wrath type people. And so, but this is not who we are. This is a result of failed environmental policy, failed capitalism, all this sort of stuff, just the failed idea of people living out in rural America trying to, these were hard people.
Yeah.
Tough people. And so the stories are what brought me back. I would listen to the stories. There's a tradition called the winter count, and people would come together and they would tell these stories, and that's how I've learned about the identity that changed me, that got me off of doing things I shouldn't have been doing. And so to see a president sign a mandate to say, you can't tell your story unless it looks like this.
Right.
Unless it looks like my story. And the story that he wants people to stop questioning or exploring is the white Euro immigrant story. And that's the part I never can understand about a lot of these guys is they don't realize they're down on immigrants, but they might be fourth, fifth generation immigrants, but they're immigrants
Yeah, they are.
to
They
this
are.
continent. And they only want people to tell that story, this great American story. And it's dangerous. We saw, wasn't the superintendent in Tucson who banned basic call to consciousness and banned Paulo Freire's work.
Right.
What was it? The Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Right.
And so writers like Cisneros and teaching their work that's, take this pain, this identity, this journey, and turn it into art. You would think that's what we would want to be teaching people, right? Is how to take all that instead of, as I'm totally against this idea going into these Seattle and Portland and burning down the town and break. I don't know where the truth of that, where that comes from.
Right.
I don't think it comes from the peaceful protesters.
Right.
But I'm totally against that. I just think that's the wrong strategy. This
Right.
is the strategy where we bring people in and we teach critical thinking. And here in the lab, we have this place where students can come and tell their stories and use art and use their minds, and to me, to take that away from us is then what? What happens? Then people revert to violence?
Right. I think so. I think you take away what is part of being human.
Right.
We were just talking, and this is another doubt I have now, because we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee on campus, and we're starting some initiatives, and I'm like, is that going to go away? Because this is what we talk about. And one of the things that we were talking about yesterday in a meeting was we have to do a better job of listening to our students' stories.
That's right.
Because that's the way to pull them in and to make them feel welcome and to validate their experience. And eventually, right, have them be successful in graduating. And that's one of the keys in having students graduate. But how do you do that without them telling you their story? There's no way.
You can't.
It's like, show me your car. Okay, well, yeah, that's nice. I don't know you because you have like an old Chevy Nova.
Right.
Tell me the story about how you got that 67 Chevy Nova.
Yeah.
And then we can get to know each other a little bit better. But I just finished reading a book in the summer called Sapiens. And it's a story of how mankind came to be. And one of the critical moments in us becoming human is when we started using language. And when we first started getting more sophisticated in our use of our language than other species, what we did is we told stories.
That's right.
That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about.
We tell stories, And sometimes these stories compete with each other, but that's okay. That's part of the process. But I agree with you. To tell a group of people, we want you to have this one story. We don't want to hear your stories, all right? We want just this one story. That's the one narrative. And to argue that that's un-American, I think it's quite the opposite. It's un-American not to listen to people's stories. So when I read this, it was like a kick in the gut.
Well, I'm going to challenge you. You've said you're on this, what is it, DEI Council? So I'm going to challenge you that I want to see a statement in the next 7 days refuting this mandate.
Okay. I'll bring that up.
Publicly. And if that doesn't happen, then it's just another, I'm not even going to pay attention to it anymore because, the idea, you got to get in the game.
I agree.
And this is serious stuff,
I'm going to bring it up, and I'll tell you right now, I'm going to bring it up, and we need to do that. That needs to be said.
Absolutely.
That needs to be said.
It could be one sentence, two sentences. I mean, we just watched a debate where a guy would refuse to, talk about the white nationalists and white supremacy and stuff. And so if we're going to be critical of that, then you have to practice it, I think.
Absolutely. I agree.
And put that statement out because it's unacceptable for everybody knows what they're getting at. And I think a lot of it to me has to do with intellectual laziness. just people saying, no, I don't want to grow. I don't want to read. I don't want to study. I don't want to travel. I don't want to experience other people's language and food and culture. Therefore, I'm just going to tell you to knock it off. You know what I mean? For the young kids who are looking for their own story,
Absolutely.
outside of violence. There's a man in Canada named Harold Johnson. He wrote an amazing. He has a master's of law degree from Harvard University. He'd served in the Canadian Navy, and he did his research on the Nocebo Effect. And the Nocebo Effect is about when people internalize the colonial story. And in this case, the story was, he talks here too about, he says that he said that stories have the power to heal or kill you, right? And he talks about the story that has been projected on Native men, lazy, dirty, drunken Indian story has been one of the most damaging stories ever invented. Because people, the nocebo effect is when you then, I call it colonizing yourself.
Right.
Right. That you take this story on, and that's how you see yourself. Because it's like you're trying to be, in his case, a Canadian, but you're an Indian, and the Canadian story is that you're a drunken, dirty Indian, and so where do you go with that?
Yeah.
And there's nowhere to go with that.
No.
Right. You're just going to, like he says, it has the power to kill you, and we see that here in America all the time with that same story, and people then live out that idea of who they are. And when things are hard, and then when doors get shut and doors get shut and doors get shut, now we're talking about thought. We're talking about a commander-in-chief who is signing a memorandum, right, to close down thought, right? So then where do you go? Are you going to then internalize this stuff, and then we're going to have more riots? So this is not smart on any level to even touch this stuff, but hopefully in the end, it'll make these disciplines stronger if people, in the position that you have, say something about it, right? We're going to continue. I bet I produced over, I don't know, 100 or so individual stories about, and now Mesa has a checkbox, Euro-American, so I guess we can use that term, right? That, we've helped students, white students, tell their beautiful story of their immigration story. And it's stuff like a lot of people have never thought about.
Right.
We've been here for 4 or 5 generations, and then we help them, and they go back and they talk to their grandparents, and all of a sudden they have this beautiful story.
Right.
And we do that for everybody. And so, again, like inside of critical race theory, I don't think these guys, they're so lazy intellectually that they don't think about that. If you otherwise it just becomes a racist thing, because then you're saying, well, I don't want to hear the African American story. I don't want to hear the Mexican American story, right? But they never think about, well, the Irish American story has a story too.
Yeah.
Right? And the Italian, and right? It's like, oh, no, those are just Americans. Like, no, you're not getting it, And so I think the power of story is something we have to protect, because as everybody says, this is all we have to fight off illness and death. Right? So the idea is, if you take that away, we'll only have illness and death.
Absolutely.
Maybe some people want it that way. And I think even in Cisneros' book, when you get back to home, and especially in Woman Hollering Creek, right, as people find their identity back home, and it's in the language too, right? So I had to learn words, individual words in the language, and I would go to ceremonies and like sort of figure this stuff out, right? It's in my soul, right? It's there. It just needs to be woke, as they say.
Yeah.
And I think in almost every language, you'll find the word, like in my dad's language, they say "aniwahoya," And what it just simply means is like human being. And this is where we're trying to get back to.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So we're trying to weed through all these entities to be human beings
Right.
that share this planet. Is there words like that in Spanish that I mean, when you talk about Spanish, we're talking about Spain, yeah? Latin. So when you get back to the indigenous point of view of Juarez, the people in Juarez, when we were down there, I was talking to a guy about that. And he said it was the people of the Sierra, right?
Right.
The mountains there?
The mountains.
So is there a language or is there a word that starts to connect you as an indigenous person in Spanish?
I think the word that, I think it's used in the U.S. as well. It's raza.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
Raza.
Yeah. The people.
The people.
Yeah.
It's like you can say, he's raza. It's like he's one of us, and he may be white. He may be black. He may be Native American.
Right.
It's raza. Like he's good or she's good. Yeah, raza. I think raza. And at one time, one of the ministers of education in Mexico, Vasconcelos, this was in the 1920s, and there was a bit of a nationalist strain to this. He said that Mexicans are la raza cósmica, the cosmic race, because Mexicans have this combination. A Mexican is a mestizo. It's a mixed blood of European and indigenous blood, people who are native to this continent and people who are European. And he was idealizing it as like sort of a perfect race, as it were, not taking into account that there were a lot of slaves in Mexico who came from Africa and they became part of the country too, that Mexico treated indigenous cultures, very poorly as well. But the word is raza. Raza. Yeah.
Isn't that beautiful?
It's a great word.
And if we start making laws that prevent people to explore language and culture outside of the Eurocentric story, we're gonna have problems. We're gonna have bigger problems than we have now, right? Yeah. I mean, because if you look at, you're talking about folks that came here and had to invent a country, right? And this is one of the things that Benjamin Franklin was like a master at. And I read what supposedly is Christopher Columbus's journal, and I read, that whole journey part of coming here. And then I really read a lot about Jefferson and Franklin. And Franklin was bound and determined to create folklore. He's like, we have to have stories that connect us to this place. That's where you get these George Washington, threw a coin across the river,
right.
never told a lie,
and
which
the
is
cherry
a lie.
tree.
Yeah. The fact that the story that says that George Washington never told a lie is a lie.
Right.
So apparently, if we're not careful, what I just said right there could be a crime.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the kind of stuff
that's un-American.
We can't have. And that is un-American.
It's un-American.
Right?
Wow.
So, but again, Franklin understood the power of story, right? There's a scholar, Lamson, that wrote in 2014, or he quoted this guy here about when you're in a university and you have Eurocentric curriculum only. For native people, he in his dissertation, he came down to these 4 choices. Students either need to try harder to be less Indian, change the criteria upon which they are being judged, accept or devalue their own status, or leave the institution, right?
Those are the options.
These are the options when you have only a Eurocentric view of curriculum in higher education, of what's being taught. Because anybody, that knows their identity, depends on where they are in that spectrum. Again, it's hard to sit there and listen to these types of things, I didn't get involved with like the kinds of activism and stuff, the college scene, till I was in a class where, remember that movie Dances with Wolves came out. So I knew all those guys. Floyd was really kind and good to me. But the teacher was saying, yeah, well, I saw that movie. It was in the movie theater. It was a big deal because they were speaking a native language, I think was one of them. But he walked in and said, the one thing the movie didn't do is show how horrible Indian people must have smelled, how dirty they were. Like they never really could get that. And I'm sitting in the back of the room. I'm already scared to death to be in college in the first place. I got on a red bandana. I got hair down to my waist, and I didn't know what to do. My daughter was 4 or 5, something like that, 6, 7 years old at the time. And all I remember is standing up. To this day, I'm not exactly sure what I said, but I just said something and I walked out of the room, right? So I took the last choice, which was to leave the institution.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, I'm not doing this. But then, by the time I got out to my truck or wherever I was going, I started thinking, no, this is my homeland. This is my homeland. I don't have to listen to this, And that started a journey for me that's lasted, the rest of my life up until now. And I can tell you that kind of attitude still exists.
Well, and not just in academia, Eddie. I mean, the whole country. That's the country. That's assimilation. That's assimilation.
So then, because of writers like Cisneros, because of art, because of literature, because of critical race theory and tribal critical race theory, we have a choice now, right? Like, I don't have to be violent about being who I am. And you would think people would appreciate that, right? So that's where that, like, for me, the inherent sovereignty thing just started developing for me. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, quoted someone as saying, "It's better to light a candle than curse the darkness."
Right.
And, over time, I just started really studying, and I wanted to know more about sovereignty and what that means, like quit playing with these guys. Like the more I'm trying to convince them that their thing is wrong, the less time I'm over here building the kind of communities that are authentic, right? That we want to become,
right?
Healthy. That's what we want. We want, and this is the thing that in ASU over there with John Tipiconic is that the whole idea is to produce healthy, well-balanced thinking leaders in the future. Well, you can't do that without stories.
Stories, yeah.
Right?
You need stories.
You can't. Nobody can be healthy and well-balanced and well-adjusted and have self-esteem about who they are if the government is now going to start saying you're not going to talk about what happened.
Right.
So I guess we could go on and on.
Yeah. Well, and, part of the mythology of this country is that you're an individual, and if you do well, what you do is you pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you have to, and you have this work ethic, and you have a Christian ethic as well. But that's a myth. The fact is, wherever you come from, you did not pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You had other people helping you. You had family, you had friends, you had connections.
That's right.
You had colleagues, you name it. I mean, you had people helping you. And it's really a myth. And it's this myth that focuses on the individual as the center of the culture, when it's really the larger community, and the larger communities that make up this country. And those communities can be Vietnamese or Vietnamese American or Polish American or Irish or Italian or Native American, you name it. But these are the communities that make up this country. And to deny those communities that are on the fringes because they're poor or because they're the wrong color, their story, that's un-American.
That's right.
That's what's un-American.
Yeah.
So
then who's the real socialist, right?
Yeah, but here we are.
Or worse.
Here we are.
Yeah, I mean, when we had a show earlier, and I was nervous about, we're faculty. Like, do we talk about politics, or how do we talk about politics? But here, it's a very easy case to make because we have a memorandum, that clearly states, you will not talk about this, or or it's the beginnings of exploring it, right? The suspicion. Right? It shouldn't you know. And so I think it's our duty. It's our duty as faculty, because otherwise it falls on the student to make these arguments, which is, in one hand, I think a good college experience too, especially at the university, where people are becoming community leaders and thought leaders and leaders in general. You know, this is what they're doing. This is the material they have to work with, right?
Right.
And there is that. But I think as faculty, it is our duty, at least as long as in this country we have freedom of speech and academic freedom, to exercise our rights.
I agree.
Without fear, you know.
I agree. But I also, and this is my experience, I guess, over the last few decades, as I've learned, is even within the hallowed halls of academia, we have faculty who want to suppress stories, you know, and I respect their right to tell their stories. What I cannot respect is they're using their story to suppress all other stories.
Yeah.
There was an email chain a couple of weeks ago in which this one faculty member wanted his story to be the end-all and the be-all, and he got some pushback. But I was a bit frustrated by the fact that more of our faculty got excited about our salary schedule than they did about this faculty member who was really espousing a racist perspective, you know, of anybody who was not white. But yes, I still think our job as faculty members is to allow students to tell their stories and for us to tell our story. And the role of language, Eddie, you mentioned it. I still remember we were in a department meeting and you said something in your own language, and like it was really cool. It was really cool. I had no idea what you were saying. I think you told us afterwards. But even as you said it, just to hear you speak another language and even to see your body language, it was like you were like another person. And that was cool. One of our past presidents, Dr. Pan, he was reading at Rhodes Junior High, and he read a poem in Chinese. And he had written this poem, and it was in Chinese, and he read it in Chinese. And he was up on the stage, and I like physically saw him change his body language, and it was so cool. But so many people are threatened by another language. That's one of the other mythologies of this country, that you can have one language express what everybody in this country feels or what everybody is. Right. And I was in a department many years ago. We had some guests from a university in Sonora, and one of them I was actually hosting at my house, Rogelio Noriega. This is about maybe 15 years ago. And we were at the front counter, and we were speaking Spanish because that's his language and it's my language, and we just fell into it. And the chair came out, and I think you know who she is. She came out and she told us that we couldn't speak Spanish. And Eddie, I was so pissed off. And Rogelio looked at me and he's like, ¿Qué pedo? Which means like, what the fuck's going on, right? I said, let's go. And we walked out, and I cussed her out in Spanish, just my friend and I. It's like, and he's like, what is wrong with her? It's like, she's a racist, man. She is a racist.
Did you guys stop? You should have just ignored her.
We just said to each other, vamos afuera. Yeah. And we left. It made me so uncomfortable that this is a person who has an advanced degree and who's the chair of our department, telling to people at the front counter who are speaking Spanish, who actually have the ability to speak in English, right, not to speak Spanish. We have students who speak another language and they can't speak English. What are you going to do? Prohibit them from speaking? Right. Not let them tell a story? So some of these experiences, in terms of language and expressing who we are in this country, sometimes run counter to that narrative that you have to assimilate, you have to speak English, that's the only way, this is the only story, be an individual, and the same thing that, our president believes. Well, it's just a shame in America that the idea of knowing different languages is perceived as some kind of negative. Where if you travel the world, like in Europe, I've worked in Europe, I've worked in Switzerland, Italy, Germany, France, and,
I'm the dumb American, right? Because as you go into these places, and I have friends over there, and they move between Spanish and Italian and German. And,
It's beautiful.
it's just like you're expected to know more than one language. It's master learning over there when you're growing up.
Yeah.
You don't just learn High German. If you're in Switzerland, you learn Italian, you learn French, and it's a positive thing. Whereas here we feel like, well, if you know more than one language, it's going to destroy our country. It's like,
I know
what?
that's
How do again? It's just like this sense of laziness, intellectual, and it's this or I don't even know how you would, I'm not even sure the right words how to describe nationalism in that.
it's nationalism. I think
Yeah.
there's fear, there's paranoia. I don't know if our chair thought, we were talking about her, right? Because
Right.
you're talking about me. It's like you are the furthest thing from our mind, man.
Right.
We were just talking about where to go get some
Yeah.
food, man.
Yeah. And then again, English is an immigrant language,
Yeah.
right? Like there, I said it.
It came here
Yeah,
from somewhere
It
else.
came here, and it's this mix. And again, it's this bastardized language of multiple languages, right?
Absolutely.
That sort of have evolved into what we call American English. Because I
American
know that English, I've been in London, they think we're like peasants. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Keegan's French.
European Creole. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that, man. I've been down in Louisiana. I've been really blessed by life to travel a lot. And I love culture.
Yeah.
I love language. I just
I
love
love
to be
hearing
around.
other languages.
Yeah, and food and music, dress, all that stuff. And so the idea of these people, that get their hands on the reins, that only want to put it in one identity, and that's been our job, is to resist the melting pot of America, because the strengths of America are diversity. They're not singular, right? And the only way we can do that, to me, the positive way, is story.
Absolutely.
Story, to write story. And now, of course, we've modernized the written word over here, and we do short documentaries, but we want people to tell their story. I've learned so much about the Mormon community here in Mesa. I didn't know anything about the Mormon community until I moved here.
Yeah.
I've learned just these beautiful stories, right? And I've learned stories from Yaqui, the Yaqui perspective, and from the, other tribe, Pima, Navajo, Apache, Mexican American, Chicano, and so we need more of this, not less.
I agree.
This is the healing that we need,
I agree. I had I had the opportunity to meet one of our students. She is our student body president. Her name is Judith Nonte, I think is her last name. And she and I were talking one day, and she just happened to tell me that her parents are from Mexico. And right away, it's like, what part of Mexico? It's
Yeah.
like, well, central Mexico. They're also indigenous Mexican. And I said, really? And she goes, yeah, they're Otomi. And Otomi is an indigenous group. And from what I know, the Otomi were a civilization, and they still exist, like in central Mexico, right? So I told her, what's your address? She goes, what? So what is your address? We're on the phone. What is your address? She gives me her address. I'm going to send you a book, right? So at the University of Guanajuato, these three men published a children's book based on the story of Don Quixote, right, by Cervantes. But it's a children's book, and it's a picture book, and it's illustrated. And one of the authors, David Wright, wrote the English text. And then Benjamin Valdivia wrote the Spanish text. And then one of their friends wrote the text in Otomi. So it's a trilingual book.
Beautiful.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And so I send it to Judith, knowing that she speaks English and Spanish, and her parents speak Otomi. And she gets it, and her family cries, Eddie.
Yeah.
And they sent me a video of her sister reading and her parents telling her, no, this is how you pronounce this word in Otomi, because it's in Otomi, and she's struggling to read it, but she's giving it a go, and her parents are telling her this is the way it's pronounced, whatever. And it made me cry too, because, we connected, based on the story, and a story that's been written, and the book was written in Mexico, but there was an Otomi man who wrote that text, and it's based on a perhaps the greatest novel in the world, right? Don Quixote by Cervantes. We always talk about Shakespeare, but Cervantes was right up there with him.
Right.
And it touched the family. So it's those stories, and stories that are expressed in the language in which you're most comfortable, that are very, very valuable to us as humans. We got to have those stories. That's all we have, Eddie.
Yeah.
That's all we have. As Bettoni, I think it was Bettoni, right? I think he was a medicine man. Bettoni's telling Tayo or Teo.
Right.
Yeah, it's a great book. I love that book. And that part is one of my favorite parts, yeah.
Every time I go through Gallup, I used to carry that book with me for years and years. And I tell you, I met. So when I was a undergraduate student, I wrote this story called John Red Eagle, and I discuss about me coming out of addiction, and the elders there in Oklahoma bringing me into the circle, into the gourd dance, to the drum, putting a blanket on me, and praying over me. And I was a mess, really was. And they saved me. And so when I read that book, I couldn't help but, fancy, this sort of grandiose connection to Teo, right? Because I knew what it was like to be lost in the world, and to be hopeless, and addiction to overtake me. And then I also knew what it was like to be healed through indigenous prayer. And that's still the center of where I'm at. That's the road I'm on. I don't want to get bogged down into other things. I'm pretty determined to, as they asked me to, when they gave me my eagle feathers, and I use the word they, and that has thrown people off too, but that's the way the old people always talked, right? So I think ultimately we're probably talking about the holy ones, the spirit.
They,
Yeah.
Like, who's they?
Yeah, right. Like, what do you mean they, It's like, well, that's just the way the older people spoke. Right? And so people that came together and gave me my eagle feathers for the first time, they give you a charge. And the charge for me, because they knew how sick I was to always find the good in everybody. Always find the best in everybody. And that, to this day, is my challenge. And I'm so grateful that was the charge, because, I'm now at an age where I'm trying to find that in myself.
Right.
And I can see where these negative, if you're not careful, you get sucked into their negativity. And that's why, my dissertation work was around inherent sovereignty, because I can get there and then I'm reminded, like, oh, no, wait. That's, there's some of that I need to do, but for the most part, I need to keep cultivating my story. And part of that was to learn words, the language, because I'm not fluent. I never want to come off that way. I'm very familiar with the language, and I try to learn words, and it took me a long time, honestly. I was always nervous about publicly trying to speak, because you know what I mean? There's all that stuff going on. But it is the language, man. It's the culture. It's that part that when you're describing this experience with your student and their family and these generations and the interconnectedness of language and culture, that's a beautiful story in and of itself. You should write about that, man.
Yeah,
right?
It is. I mean, I do.
Yeah.
I do write about that some. But, the stories and the language, are so important. And getting back to this mandate, You and I were talking just before we came in. Part of what really bothers me about this mandate is that I know that our president doesn't like people like me. You know, he said it, he doesn't like Mexicans. So when he doesn't allow me to tell my story or to share my story with students or to have them tell me their stories, whether they're poor white or whether they're middle class white or whether they're Asian American or Mexican American, whatever the terms mean, I have to learn to deal with this better, Eddie. It festers anger in me.
Right.
It festers anger with me, and I need to figure out a way past that without going to a place where potentially violence, you know, I'm not a violent man, I wouldn't do anything, but potentially violence becomes a way to deal with this. And what ends up happening, and you know this too, is sometimes we internalize not just the story, but the violence.
Right.
So we get sick, you know, because we've internalized this, because we have this one person telling us, I don't care about your story. We're individuals, but to him that means you're like me and I'm not like you, and you have told me that you hate people like me.
Yeah.
And where does that leave me if you don't let me tell my story? It leaves me in a place of anger.
Yeah, and I think one day we're going to get to learn what he thinks of a lot of people, right?
I think it's clear, but yeah.
Yeah. But again, it goes back to all this stuff in critical race theory that they want to question and make suspicious, and all of that is that's where these things like the Nocebo Effect and self-colonization and assimilation, that's where all of that understanding comes from.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Scholars and working with traditional people and all of that to understand, you know, how to decolonize. What does decolonization mean? And that, in many ways, that's what the American Revolution was all about. They were decolonizing themselves away from the monarchies in Europe, France, Spain, English, right? That was the whole idea of the American experiment in the Constitution, was to separate religion and church and state, and you know, this idea of free expression.
Yeah.
Right. That you could be who you want to be. For Indian people, it's like this same entity that proclaims freedom, you know, denies Indian people a history.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Denies a future, but it also denies a present when you start having mandates like this. You know, Russell Means, the American Indian movement, or just, you know, Lakota leader, used to say, you can be anything you want in America except an American Indian, right?
Yeah.
And so, these are trying times. You know, I think more will be revealed, but we have to, we can't internalize that story.
Right.
And the idea, again, is to keep seeking our natural inherent self, which is peace, you know, peace of mind. Russ used to always say the true definition of freedom is to never be in a hurry. Right? I love that.
Yeah.
Just absolutely love that,
Yeah.
you know, what is freedom? I don't need to be pushed around by this or that. But I think we'll have a day of reckoning, and I think people who are intellectually curious and spiritually hungry, I think we're going to be stronger here. You know, I think all of this, the pendulum always swings to one way or another. But, you know, this idea of one singular nationalism identity, I think people will understand the weakness of that, because we can see already that create the results of it, right? Division and violence and all this stuff. We need to learn how to appreciate one another. I was talking to an executive at a company recently, and he said to me, you know, when I look at people, I don't see color. And I said, that is such a false premise, and it really is revealing because you should see color. You should see diversity. You should see all that and appreciate it and grow by it and let that enrich you.
Right.
Because when you start saying things like, well, I'm colorblind and stuff, that, first of all, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right? You're starting to repress a lot of stuff in your own stuff. I remember Maya Angelou when she was being interviewed by Diane Sawyer, and Sawyer said the same thing. Maya, when I look at you, I don't see a black woman. I thought her head was going to come off her shoulders, right? She's like, you damn well better see a black woman. I am a black woman, right? What's wrong with seeing a black woman? Nothing. What you're talking about is what you don't want to see is all the things that repress and oppress and marginalize and disenfranchise people from success based on, that's what you're trying not to see.
Absolutely.
Right? It's not that you don't see a black woman sitting there. You're saying, well, I don't want to see all this, all the stuff that oppresses you and marginalizes you and causes pain and suffering as a human being on this continent. I don't want to see that.
Right.
That's what you're saying. And that's what this mandate is saying.
It is.
We don't want to hear it.
Point.
We don't want to see it. We don't want to deal with it. We don't want to make it a reality. We want you to shut up and be a singular identity. And what that means is, be a good worker and pay your taxes.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pay mine, but, pay your taxes. Right?
Contribute to the American economy as best you can. That's what we care about.
We have a deficit going on that's going to take generations, you know, and so... Hey, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation. We just kind of freestyling it.
That's
here.
good.
And we wanted to start off with Sandra Cisneros, and it took us to some pretty cool stuff, man. Eddie Webb, we are here at the New Media Lab having a conversation with Professor Jaime Herrera, who teaches Chicano literature here at Mesa Community College. And we want to thank you for coming over and having this conversation. And
thank you,
good
Eddie.
to see you. They say "Dona Dokohon'i," which means "I'll see you again." And in your language, how do you say goodbye?
Ahí nos vemos. It's like, see you later. Ahí nos vemos.
All right.
Thank you, Eddie. Thanks, Keegan. Yeah.
And we'll talk to y'all later. See you later.
All right. Adios.